I was standing by my husband's grave, shaking in black heels I hadn't worn in years, when my phone vibrated in my purse. A message from an unknown number. "He's not in the casket." My hands trembled, my vision blurred. I looked around at the few people who had come to say goodbye. None of them looked my way. Even my sons, Charles and Henry, barely acknowledged me. They stood beside their fathers, grave like hired actors in a play that didn't belong to them. "Who is this?" I typed back, hands shaking. The reply came instantly. "They're watching. Don't trust your daughter-in-law. She's hiding the truth. Your husband isn't dead. Not the way they said." My heart stopped. I turned around, scanning the cemetery for anyone suspicious, anyone who might be watching. But everyone was avoiding my gaze, even my own family. Spring Creek Cemetery was quiet that day, except for the hollow words of the pastor and the occasional sob from a distant cousin. The May sunshine felt wrong, too bright for such a dark day. Ernest deserved rain, a proper morning from the heavens. I'm Margot Hayes, 66 years old, and until a week ago, I thought I knew my life. For 42 years, Ernest had been my safe harbor, kind, honest, strong. The town handyman who could fix anything except, apparently, his own mortality. We'd raised 2 sons in our modest home on Maple Street, filling it with love despite the leaking roof and secondhand furniture. Now I stood alone, clutching my phone, wondering if I was losing my mind or if someone was playing a cruel joke. Charles stepped forward, his expensive suit, making him look like a stranger. At 40, he'd become everything his father wasn't. Corporate, calculated, distant. He placed a single rose on the casket without emotion, then stepped back beside his wife, Jasmine. Jasmine Albright Hayes, a name too elegant for our simple family. From the moment Charles brought her home 5 years ago, she'd looked at our modest life with thinly veiled disdain. Today, she stood in designer black, her face a perfect mask of appropriate grief, not a tear disturbing her flawless makeup. Henry, my younger son at 37, stood beside them. Once the sensitive boy who brought home injured birds, he now worked for Charles's real estate development company, becoming his brother's shadow in every way. The pastor finished his generic sermon about a man he'd never really known. Ernest would have hated it. All this fuss, these empty words. He would have preferred a simple goodbye, maybe a beer shared among friends on our worn porch swing. "Mrs. Hayes?" The funeral director approached cautiously. "Would you like to say a final goodbye before we—" I nodded, unable to speak. The walk to the casket felt like miles. Ernest lay there, not looking like himself at all. Too pale, too still, his strong hands folded too neatly across his chest. The handyman's hands that had built our life together, now eerily smooth and unnaturally posed. Something didn't feel right. The accident at his workshop had been so sudden, so unexpected. Ernest, methodical and careful in everything he did, would never have been careless with his equipment. But Charles had insisted it was. A tragic accident. Some kind of explosion that had triggered a heart attack. I touched Ernest's cold cheek and whispered, "What happened to you?" My phone vibrated again. I stepped away from the casket, turned my back to the small gathering, and read, "Check his workshop. No explosion happened there. Check the insurance papers. They changed them. Check the hospital report they hid from you." I slipped the phone back into my purse, my mind racing. Who would know these things? Who would care enough to tell me? After the burial, Charles drove me home in his luxury SUV, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Henry and Jasmine followed in a separate car. "Mom," Charles finally spoke as we pulled into the driveway of the small house Ernest and I had shared for 4 decades. "Henry and I have been talking. We think it's time you consider moving somewhere more appropriate for your situation." "My situation?" I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "You're alone now. This house is too big, too old. There's a nice retirement community just outside of town. We could have you settled by the end of the month." The house wasn't big at all, just a modest 3-bedroom with more memories than square footage. And old, only in the way that it had weathered life alongside us, its imperfections telling our story. "I need time, Charles. Your father just died." "Of course," he said, but his tone suggested the discussion was merely postponed, not finished. Inside, Jasmine was already in the kitchen, making coffee no one had asked for. Henry sat at our small dining table, looking uncomfortable in the home where he'd grown up. "The funeral was lovely," Jasmine said, setting down cups of coffee I didn't want. Dignified. Ernest would have approved. No, he wouldn't have. Ernest would have called it putting on airs. He would have wanted a backyard gathering with his workshop friends, everyone sharing stories and laughing through tears. Margot. Jasmine continued, using my first name as she always did, despite my gentle corrections over the years. Charles and I think you should stay with us for a few days. You shouldn't be alone right now. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, always calculating, always assessing the value of things. People. Me. I'm fine here, I said firmly. I need to be in our home. Charles sighed, dramatically. Mom, be reasonable. Dad wouldn't want you here all alone. Ernest's voice seemed to whisper in my ear. Don't trust them, Margot. Not anymore. After they finally left, with promises to check on me tomorrow, I stood in the silence of our home. 42 years of marriage ended with a closed door and an empty house. I kicked off those awful black heels and walked in my stockinged feet to Ernest's workshop behind the house. The small detached building had been his sanctuary. I hesitated at the door, then used the key I kept on my own keyring. Inside, everything was immaculate. Tools hanging in their designated spots, projects neatly organized on shelves. The workbench where he spent countless hours creating and repairing was clean and orderly. Most importantly, there was no sign of an explosion. No scorch marks, no damaged equipment, nothing out of place. My anonymous messenger was right about this. What else were they right about? I returned to the house and went straight to Ernest's desk in our small home office. The bottom drawer contained all our important papers. I pulled out the life insurance policy and flipped through it, my heart pounding. There it was, an amendment dated just 3 months ago, increasing the payout significantly. The signature at the bottom looked like Ernest's, but something seemed off about it. The final loop of the Y in Hayes curved too sharply. After 42 years of marriage, I knew his handwriting like my own. My hands shaking, I reached for my phone and typed, "Who are you? How do you know these things?" The reply came. Minutes later. Someone who cared about Ernest. Someone who knows your sons are lying. Check the medicine cabinet in your bathroom. Count the sleeping pills. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt too large, too empty without Ernest's solid presence beside me. For 42 years, we'd shared this space. His gentle snoring, my cold feet seeking his warmth, the silent conversations we'd have in the darkness when words weren't necessary. At 3 a.m., I gave up and went to the bathroom. The anonymous message kept echoing in my mind. I opened the medicine cabinet and found my prescription sleeping pills, the ones I rarely used only on nights when my arthritis was particularly painful. I dumped them into my palm and counted 12. There should have been 26. I stood frozen, staring at the pills in my trembling hand. Who had taken them? When? Why? I returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive. By dawn, I knew what I needed to do. I needed answers, not just for my peace of mind, but for Ernest. Something wasn't right about his death, and I wouldn't rest until I knew the truth. After a cup of tea and toast I couldn't taste, I put on my most respectable outfit, a navy blue dress. Ernest always said made my eyes look young, and drove to Spring Creek Memorial Hospital. It was a small facility, just 20 beds, where everyone knew everyone else. I'd volunteered there for 15 years before my knees got too bad for the long hours of standing. Margot, Nurse Jenkins, a woman I'd known since she was a student, greeted me at the reception desk. Her face immediately softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry about Ernest. We all loved him here. Thank you, Nancy, I said, forcing a smile. I actually need a favor. I'd like to see Ernest's medical records from when he was brought in. Nancy's expression shifted, just slightly. Oh, Margot, I don't know. Charles already collected all those for the insurance. Said he was handling everything so you wouldn't have to worry. My heart beat faster. Nancy, I need to see them. Please, I was his wife for 42 years. I have a right to know exactly what happened to my husband. After a moment's hesitation, Nancy nodded. Wait here. 20 minutes later, I sat in a small consultation room, a thin file folder in front of me. Nancy had whispered, "Take your time," before leaving me alone with the truth. The FAO medical report was clinical, detached, words that reduced Ernest to symptoms and procedures. But one paragraph made my blood run cold. Patient presented with symptoms consistent with methanol poisoning, severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, blurred vision. Despite aggressive treatment, patient suffered cardiac arrest at 23:47. Resuscitation attempts unsuccessful. Time of death, 00.12. Methanol poisoning. Not an explosion. Not a heart attack triggered by an accident. My hands shook as I turned the page. There was a note from the emergency physician. Requested toxicology report to confirm methanol levels. Family member, son, declined, citing unnecessary expense and delay in funeral arrangements. Death certificate issued as cardiac arrest following workplace accident per family. Request. Charles had declined the toxicology report. Charles had pushed for the death certificate to list an accident. I carefully took photos of every page with my phone before returning the file to Nancy. "Margot, are you all right?" she asked, concern etching her kind face. "You're white as a sheet." "Just hard to read the details," I managed. "Thank you for this, Nancy." "There's something else?" Nancy said hesitantly. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Charles and Henry were already here when Ernest was brought in by ambulance. I thought it was strange, because according to the paramedics, no one had called them yet. They just showed up. Before you." My stomach twisted into knots. "What time was Ernest brought in?" "Around 9:30 p.m. Charles and Henry arrived maybe 10 minutes later. We didn't call you until after the doctors had assessed him, around 10 p.m. I nodded, unable to form words, and walked to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. Once inside, I broke down, sobs racking my body. Not just from grief, but from a terrible suspicion taking root in my mind. Had my sons, my own flesh and blood, killed their father? My phone chimed with a new message. "You found the hospital records. Now you know. Ernest didn't die by accident. Meet me at Willow Creek Bridge tomorrow at noon if you want to know more. Come alone." I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to face. Our modest house, the one Charles and Henry had been pressuring us to sell for the past year, looked different now. Less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene. Inside, I went straight to Ernest's desk again. This time, I pulled open the secret compartment he thought I didn't know about. A small space behind the bottom drawer where he kept his most private papers. Inside was an envelope with my name on it, sealed. With shaking hands, I opened it. "My dearest Margot," Ernest's familiar handwriting began. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I pray it's nothing sinister, but I've had my suspicions lately that our boys are up to something. They've been asking strange questions about our finances, the house, my life insurance. Charles especially seems determined to get his hands on everything we've worked for." The letter continued, detailing conversations Ernest had overheard, papers he'd found moved in his desk, calls from the insurance company confirming changes he hadn't made. "I've hired a private investigator, Stephen Callahan. His number is below. If anything happens to me that doesn't feel right, contact him immediately. He has information." The letter ended with words that made tears stream down my face. "I've loved you every day of our life together, Margot. You deserved better sons than the men they've become. Be careful. Trust your instincts. They were always sharper than mine. Always yours, Ernest." I sat at his desk for a long time, clutching the letter to my chest, feeling his presence all around me in this room where he'd spent so many evenings paying bills and writing in his journal. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the number from the letter. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Callahan. Mr. Callahan? This is Margot Hayes, Ernest Hayes' wife. I found his letter. I think my husband was murdered." The line was silent for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Hayes, I've been waiting for your call. I'm the one who's been texting you. We need to talk, but not over the phone. Willow Creek Bridge, tomorrow, noon." The line went dead, leaving me alone with a truth too terrible to comprehend. Sleep was impossible that night. I kept seeing Ernest's face, not the waxy funeral home version, but the real Ernest with laugh lines around his eyes and that crooked smile that had first caught my attention at the Spring Creek Fair in 1979. Had he known what was coming? Had he suspected his own sons? By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. I dressed carefully in a simple blouse and slacks, clothes that wouldn't draw attention. Before leaving, I slipped Ernest's letter into my purse alongside a small can of pepper spray I'd kept in my nightstand for years. Willow Creek Bridge was a 15-minute drive from our house, a historic stone structure spanning a narrow but deep creek on the outskirts of town. In summer, children would swim beneath it, their laughter echoing against the stone arches. Today, in early May, the water ran high and fast with spring rains, and the place was deserted. I parked in the small gravel lot and checked my watch. 11:55 a.m. I was early, but not alone. A man stood at the center of the bridge, leaning against the stone railing, watching the rushing water below. Mid-60s, with salt and pepper hair and the solid build of someone who'd once been very strong and had only slightly softened with age. When he saw me approaching, he straightened up. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, not a question, but a recognition. His voice matched the one on the phone, gravelly, like he'd spent years shouting over machinery or giving orders. "Mr. Callahan." I stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure. "You worked for my husband. Your husband hired me 3 months ago. Said his sons were acting strange, asking too many questions about his finances, pressuring him to sell the house." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I've been recording them." My heart hammered in my chest. "Recording my sons?" "Your husband was worried. With good reason, as it turns out." His weathered face softened slightly. "Mrs. Hayes, what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to hear. Are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Ernest deserves the truth." Stephen Callahan nodded, his expression grim. "Your sons have been planning this for months. Your husband suspected something was wrong when they suddenly became interested in his life insurance policy. He caught Charles in his home office one day, going through his papers. When he confronted him, Charles claimed he was just helping organize things." "That doesn't sound like Charles," I said automatically, then paused. The truth was, I didn't know what sounded like Charles anymore. My ambitious, distant son had become a stranger years ago. Ernest asked me to follow them, record their conversations when possible. What I found, he shook his head. They were in financial trouble, Mrs. Hayes. Big trouble. Charles's real estate business is failing. He's leveraged to the hilt. Henry's got gambling debts. They needed money, and they needed it fast. The rushing water below seemed to grow louder in my ears. "And our house? The life insurance? Your property sits on 3 acres at the edge of town. Prime location for development. Charles has a buyer lined up, a chain hotel willing to pay 7 times what the property is worth. But Ernest refused to sell. Said he'd promised you'd live out your days in that house. A promise he'd made on our 30th anniversary, sitting on the porch swing, his calloused hand holding mine. This is our forever home, Margot. No matter what the kids say, we're staying right here until they carry us out feet first. The insurance policy," Callahan continued, "was changed to list Charles as the primary beneficiary instead of you. The signature was forged. I have proof." He pulled a folder from his jacket. Ernest's original signature compared to the forgery. An expert would testify they don't match. I opened the folder with trembling hands. There it was, the evidence that my sons had. Planned to steal even my widow's support. "But murder?" I whispered. "Surely they wouldn't." Callahan pressed a button on the recorder. Charles's voice filled the quiet morning air. "We've tried everything, Henry. He's not budging on the house. Mom's completely under his thumb. She'll never agree to move as long as he's alive." Henry's voice hesitant. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. Dad's standing in the way of everything. The property deal falls through in 60 days if we can't deliver. We lose everything. The business, your condo, my house. Jasmine's already talking divorce if I can't maintain our lifestyle." "Jesus, Charles, you can't be serious." "Methanol is untraceable if done right. Looks just like a heart attack in an old man. No autopsy for a natural death. We get the insurance, we get the property, we solve our problems." I clutched the stone railing of the bridge, suddenly dizzy. "Turn it off," I whispered. "Please." Callahan stopped the recording. "There's more. 23 recordings over 3 months. Discussions about the methanol, about stealing your sleeping pills to crush and mix with his evening whiskey, about staging an accident at his workshop afterward to explain any unusual symptoms. Jasmine," I managed to say. "Was she involved?" A grim nod. "She's on several recordings. She was the one who suggested the methanol. Her father was a chemist. She knew exactly how it worked, how to obtain it, how much to use." I closed my eyes, trying to process the horror of it all. My daughter-in-law, the woman who smiled coldly at family gatherings, who called me Margot dear, with thinly veiled contempt, had designed my husband's murder. "What do I do now?" I asked, opening my eyes to find Callahan watching me with unexpected compassion. "We take this to the police," he said simply. I have copies of everything. The recordings, the forged documents, photos of your property listings that went up, before your husband was even in the ground. Combined with the hospital records you found, it's enough for an investigation. They're my sons, I said, my voice breaking. My little boys. They're grown men who killed their father for money, Callahan said, his tone gentle but firm. Ernest hired me because he wanted the truth protected. He wanted you protected. A car pulled into the gravel lot. Behind us, a sleek black SUV I recognized immediately. Charles's car. He followed you, Callahan said quietly, slipping the recorder and folder into my hands. Put these in your purse. Now. I barely had time to hide the evidence before Charles was striding onto the bridge, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He wore a business suit despite it being Saturday, his face a mask of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Mom, what are you doing out here? We've been worried sick. His gaze shifted to Callahan. Who's this? Just getting some fresh air, I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. This is Mr. Callahan, an old friend of your father's. Charles's eyes narrowed slightly. Dad never mentioned a Callahan. Funny, Callahan said, his gravelly voice calm. He mentioned you quite a bit. A flash of something, uncertainty, fear, crossed Charles's face before his mask of concern returned. Mom, you shouldn't be out here alone. You're still grieving. Let me take you home. Home. The house he'd been trying to sell out from under us. The house where Ernest had been poisoned. I'm fine, Charles. Mr. Callahan is giving me a ride back. I insist. Charles took my arm, his grip firm. Family should be together at a time like this. I looked into my son's eyes, Ernest's eyes, inherited but somehow colder, and made my decision. You're right, I said, patting his hand. Family should be together. Let's go home. Charles drove too fast on the winding country roads back to town, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat silently in the passenger seat, my purse clutched tightly in my lap, containing the evidence of my son's betrayal. Who was that man, really? Charles finally asked, his voice tight. I told you, a friend of your father's. Dad didn't have friends like that. Ex-military? Ex-cop? When I didn't answer, Charles continued, Mom, you need to be careful. There are people who prey on grieving widows. Whatever he's selling you, he's not. Selling anything? I interrupted. We were just talking about Ernest. Charles's jaw tightened. I don't want you meeting with strangers. It's not safe. The concern might have touched me once. Now it sounded like what it was. Control, manipulation, the fear of exposure. I'm not a child, Charles. I don't need your permission to have conversations. He shot me a look I couldn't quite interpret. You've changed since Dad died. Death changes people, I replied simply. We pulled into my driveway to find Jasmine's red sports car already parked there. My stomach clenched at the sight of it. Inside, Jasmine was in my kitchen again, this time arranging store-bought cookies on one of my plates. She looked up with a practiced smile. Margot! Charles was so worried when he couldn't find you. Her eyes, calculating as ever, assessed me from head to toe. You look tired. Have you been taking those sleeping pills I brought over? The sleeping pills. My missing pills. I forced a smile. Not yet. I haven't been sleeping well, though. You should take one tonight, she urged, pushing a mug of tea toward me. I made you some chamomile. It helps with grief, they say. I looked at the steaming mug, then back at Jasmine's perfectly made-up face. Did she think I was next? Was there something in the tea even now? Thank you, I said, not touching it. I'll drink it later, when it's cooled down. Charles paced the small living room, checking his watch. We need to talk about the house, Mom. The insurance company needs paperwork filled out. There's the matter of Dad's workshop, his tools. It's been a week, Charles, I said quietly. Exactly. Time is moving on, and there are practical matters to attend to. Practical matters. Like hotel developers waiting for my home. I found some interesting papers in Ernest's desk, I said casually. Insurance documents, property assessments. Charles went very still. Dad always was disorganized with paperwork. I'll take care of all that. There's no rush, I said. I'd like to go through everything myself. Jasmine joined us, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors Ernest had refinished by hand 5 years ago. Margot, Charles and I were thinking, it might be good for you to get away for a while. Our lake house is empty. You could stay there, have some peace and quiet. Their lake house, 2 hours away, isolated, the perfect place for an elderly woman to have an unfortunate accident. That's very kind, I said, but I need to be here, close to Ernest. He's gone, Mom, Charles said sharply. Staying here, surrounding yourself with his things, it's not healthy. Gone. My Ernest, reduced to a past tense in his son's mouth. I'm tired, I said suddenly. I think I need to lie down. Relief crossed both their faces. They thought they were winning. Of course, Jasmine said. Should I help you upstairs? No need. I know the way to my own bedroom. I moved toward the stairs, then paused. Actually, Charles, could you check the back door lock before you leave? It's been sticking. The request was ordinary enough that Charles nodded, heading toward the kitchen. The moment he was out of sight, I whispered to Jasmine, I know what you did to Ernest. Her perfectly composed face faltered for just a second, a micro-expression of shock quickly masked by confusion. I don't know what you mean. Methanol, I whispered. His workshop, the sleeping pills. I know everything. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. You're confused with grief, Margot. Perhaps you should take those. Pills after all. Charles returned before I could respond. Lock's fine, Mom. Just needs some WD-40. Ernest would have fixed it properly. Taken the mechanism apart, cleaned it, adjusted it with careful hands. His son offered a temporary solution. A quick fix. Like everything else in his life. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling their eyes on my back. In my bedroom, I locked the door, then moved. The heavy dresser in front of it, a barricade against my own flesh and blood. With shaking hands, I called Stephen Callahan. They know, I whispered into the phone. Charles followed me to the bridge. They're downstairs now. I think they might try to hurt me. I'm 15 minutes away, Callahan said immediately. Don't eat or drink anything they give you. Lock your door. I'm calling. The police right now. After hanging up, I sank onto the bed Ernest and I had shared for decades. From my purse, I pulled out the evidence Callahan had given me, along with Ernest's letter. But there was something else I needed. Years ago, Ernest had built a hidden compartment in our bedroom floor, beneath the antique rug on my side of the bed. For your grandmother's jewelry, he'd said. Too valuable to keep in a regular box. I rolled back the rug and pressed the section of flooring that released the small trapdoor. Inside was the velvet pouch containing my grandmother's modest but cherished jewelry and Ernest's personal journal. I'd never read it during his life. It was his private space, his thoughts. But now, with my hands trembling, I opened it to the most recent entries. April 3. Charles came by again about selling the house, getting more insistent, mentioned some developer willing to pay top dollar. Told him again, this is Margot's home, not for sale. He didn't take it well. April 10. Found Charles in my office when I came back from the hardware store. Said he was looking for the fishing lures for Henry, but my desk drawers were open. Insurance papers moved. Something's not right. April 15. Hired Callahan today. Ex-detective, recommended by Jim at the VFW. Don't like spying on my own sons, but can't shake this feeling. Better safe than sorry. Margot would say I'm being paranoid. Maybe I am. April 28th. Callahan played me a recording today. Charles and Henry discussing methanol. My own boys. Planning my death like I'm nothing but an obstacle. Wondering if they're planning something for Margot too, after I'm gone. Made arrangements to protect her. God forgive them. I don't know if I can. May 2, the day before he died. Left a letter for Margot in the secret drawer. Put Callahan's number there too. If I'm right, I won't live to see summer. If I'm wrong, I'll burn this journal and never tell a soul what I suspected of my own flesh and blood. Margot deserves better than sons who would orphan her for money. Forgive me, my love, for leaving you with this burden. Tears streamed down my face as I read his final thoughts. His love for me, his heartbreak over our sons, his certainty that they meant him harm. I heard the front door close, then car engines starting. They were leaving, but I knew they'd be back, with the journal clutched. To my chest, I waited for Callahan and the police, surrounded by the ghosts of the family we'd once been. 15 minutes felt like hours as I sat on the edge of my bed, Ernest's journal clutched to my chest. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. Every passing car outside sent my heart racing. Had my sons really left, or were they waiting for me to let my guard down? When the doorbell finally rang, I peered cautiously through the bedroom window. Stephen Callahan stood on my porch alongside 2 uniformed police officers. Relief washed over me as I moved the dresser away from the door and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Hayes, Officer Daniels greeted me with a solemn nod. I knew him. He'd gone to school with Charles, had even come to our house for birthday parties as a boy. Now he stood in my living room, uncomfortably shifting his weight. Mr. Callahan here says you have reason to believe your husband's death wasn't accidental. It wasn't, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He was murdered. By my sons. I led them to the dining room table and laid out everything. Ernest's letter, the journal entries, the hospital records showing methanol poisoning, and Callahan's recordings. Officer Daniels and his partner exchanged glances as the evidence mounted. Mrs. Hayes, the second officer, his nameplate read, Rivera, spoke gently. These are serious allegations against your own children. Are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this? Was I certain? The question hung in the air. If I moved forward, there would be no going back. My sons, the babies. I'd nursed, the boys I'd taught to ride bicycles, the young men I'd sent into the world with such hopes, would face murder charges. Our family name would be dragged through mud. The quiet life Ernest and I had built would end in scandal. But if I stayed silent, Ernest's killers would go free. They would take our home, erase our life together, and likely come for me next. I'm certain, I said, meeting Officer Rivera's eyes. My husband deserves justice. Officer Daniels nodded grimly. We'll need formal statements from both you and Mr. Callahan. The recordings will have to be authenticated. And, he hesitated, looking genuinely pained, we'll need to request an exhumation order for your husband's body. A proper autopsy will be required to confirm methanol poisoning. The thought of Ernest's body being disturbed made me physically ill, but I nodded. Do what you need to do. In the meantime, Callahan interjected, Mrs. Hayes isn't safe here. Her sons know she suspects something. They could come back. Do you have somewhere you can stay? Officer Rivera asked. Family? Friends? I thought of our small town, where everyone knew everyone, where Charles and Henry could find me. With a few phone calls. She can stay with me, Callahan said unexpectedly. I have a cabin outside of town, secure, off the grid. Both officers looked at him questioningly. I was a detective for 30 years before going private, Callahan explained. I know how to keep someone safe until an arrest is made. I hadn't expected this offer, but the thought of staying in the house where Ernest had been poisoned, waiting for my sons to return, was unbearable. Thank you, I said quietly. I'll pack a few things. After the officers left with copies of the evidence, promising to begin the investigation immediately, Callahan helped me gather essentials. Clothes, toiletries, medications, and, most importantly, the original journal and letter. They'll come looking for these, Callahan warned, securing the documents in a waterproof bag. Without this evidence, it becomes much harder to prove premeditation. As I packed, I found myself lingering over small things. Ernest's reading glasses on the nightstand, the sweater he'd worn the day before he died still draped over the bedroom chair, the worn paperback Western he'd been reading with a bookmark still in place. 42 years of marriage, ending not with a peaceful goodbye, but with betrayal and evidence bags. We should go, Callahan said gently from the doorway. It's not safe to stay here any longer. I nodded, taking one last look around the bedroom where Ernest and I had shared so many quiet moments. I need one more thing, I said, moving to Ernest's dresser and taking out the wooden box where he kept his cufflinks, simple ones I'd given him on our 25th anniversary. I slipped them into my pocket, a small piece of him to carry with me. We left through the back door, cutting through the garden Ernest had tended so carefully. Spring flowers were blooming, daffodils and tulips he'd planted last fall, now opening without him there to see them. Callahan drove an older model pickup truck. Nothing flashy that would draw attention. As we pulled away from the curb, I saw Charles's SUV turning onto our street. Down, Callahan instructed sharply, and I ducked below the window line. Through the sliver of visibility, I watched my son park in front of our house, his face set in grim determination as he strode up the walkway. He's back, I whispered. Too late, Callahan said, accelerating. Smoothly away from the neighborhood I'd called home for 4 decades. They won't find you now. The cabin was exactly as he'd described. Rustic, isolated, secure. Located 20 miles outside of Spring Creek, tucked into a wooded area with no visible neighbors, it was the perfect place to disappear. Inside was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a bath. Hunting rifles locked in a cabinet suggested Callahan was prepared for unwanted visitors. I come here to fish, he explained, setting my bag down. No one knows about this place except my daughter in Seattle. I sank into an armchair, suddenly exhausted. The events of the past week, Ernest's death, the funeral, the terrible revelations, crashed over me like a wave. Why are you helping? Me? I asked. Your job for Ernest ended when he died. Callahan's weathered face softened slightly. I've seen too many cases where justice never comes, where the guilty walk free because no one was willing to stand up. He paused. And Ernest was a good man. He talked about you all the time, how you stood by him when he was just a handyman with dirt under his fingernails, how you made something of nothing all those years. I closed my eyes, tears threatening again. We were happy, even without much money, even in our small house with the leaking roof. We were happy. He knew that, Callahan said quietly. That's what your sons never understood. My phone rang suddenly, Charles's number. I stared at it, unsure. Answer it, Callahan instructed. Act normal. You went to visit a friend. You'll be home tonight. I took a deep breath and accepted the call. Hello? Mom? Charles's voice held a note of panic. Where are you? I came by to check on you and you're gone. The house is empty. I'm visiting Martha, I lied, naming an old friend from church. I needed to get out of the house for a while. You shouldn't leave without telling someone, Charles scolded. I was worried. Will you be home? Later tonight, I said vaguely. Don't wait up. I'll come by tomorrow morning then, he said, an edge to his voice. We need to discuss some important matters. The insurance company called. There might be complications. My heart raced. Had they discovered the policy changes were forged? Were the walls closing in around my sons already? What complications? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Nothing for you to worry about. I'll handle everything. His tone softened artificially. That's what Dad would want, Mom. For me to take care of you now. Like he'd taken care of Ernest. I'm very tired, Charles, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. After hanging up, I looked at Callahan. He knows something's wrong. He mentioned insurance complications. The investigation has started, Callahan confirmed. The police won't waste time. Your sons and Jasmine are the obvious suspects, and with the evidence we provided, search warrants will be issued quickly. That night, in the unfamiliar bed in Callahan's cabin, I dreamed of Ernest. Not the Ernest from the casket, but my Ernest, laughing as he chased our young sons through the sprinkler on a hot summer day, his hair still dark, his arms strong around me. In the dream, he whispered, You're doing the right thing, Margot. Stay strong. I woke to the sound of rain on the metal roof and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, I imagined it was Ernest in the kitchen, that the past week had been the nightmare instead of this new reality. But when I entered the small kitchen, it was Callahan who handed me a mug of coffee, his expression grim. The police called, he said without preamble. They've obtained the exhumation order. It happens today. Rain fell steadily as I stood under a black umbrella, watching workers carefully remove Ernest's casket from the still fresh grave. The cemetery was empty except for me, Callahan, the workers, and the 2 police officers overseeing this exhumation. Officer Daniels had offered to drive me back to Spring Creek for this grim necessity, and Callahan had insisted on coming along for security. You don't have to watch this, Mrs. Hayes, Officer Daniels said gently. But I did. I needed to see it all, every painful moment of the journey toward justice for Ernest. I would not turn away, would not hide from the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The casket, barely a week in the ground, still looked unnervingly new as it was loaded into the medical examiner's van. I would not see Ernest's body again. The autopsy would be performed in the county morgue, his remains returned to the funeral home afterward. But watching his casket being driven away felt like losing him a second time. What happens now? I asked Officer Daniels, my voice barely audible over the rain. The toxicology report will take a few days, he explained. Meanwhile, we're executing search warrants on your son's homes and businesses. We're looking for the methanol, for any communications about the murder, for evidence of financial troubles that would establish motive. Motive. As if my sons needed more motive than greed. Have they been notified about the investigation? I couldn't help but ask. Officer Daniels nodded grimly. They know we're looking into your husband's death. They don't yet know the extent of the evidence against them. Back in Callahan's truck, heading out of town again, I felt strangely numb. The cemetery visit had drained what little emotional energy I had left. You did well, Callahan said, his eyes on the winding road ahead. Most people couldn't face what you just did. I keep thinking about them as children, I admitted. Charles was so protective of Henry when they were little. He taught him to ride a bike, helped him with homework. When did that boy become someone who could kill his own father? Callahan had no answer for that. No one did. My phone buzzed with a text message. Henry, not Charles. Mom, what's going on? Police were at my house this morning. They're saying Dad's death wasn't an accident. Call me ASAP. I showed the message to Callahan. Don't respond, he advised. They're fishing for information, trying to find out how much you know. We drove in silence for several miles, rain hammering on the truck's roof, before another text came through. This time from Charles, and far less. Measured, I know you're behind this. Dad's body being dug up, police searching our homes. What lies have you been telling? Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. Call me now. Callahan glanced at the message and frowned. He's panicking. That's good. Panicking people make mistakes. 2 days passed in tense waiting. I stayed at Callahan's cabin, jumping at every sound, half expecting Charles or Henry to appear at the door despite Callahan's assurances that no one could find us. I called Officer Daniels twice for updates, but the investigation was ongoing, the toxicology results not yet back. On the third morning, my phone rang, an unknown number. Mrs. Hayes, this is Dr. Littman from the County Medical Examiner's office. We've completed the autopsy on your husband. I gripped the phone, tighter. And the toxicology results confirm lethal levels of methanol in his system. This was not a natural death or an accident. I've forwarded my findings to the Spring Creek Police Department. Relief and grief washed over me in equal measure. Thank you, doctor, I managed to say before hanging up. Callahan, who had been listening from across the room, nodded solemnly. That's it then. They'll make arrests now. Within the hour, Officer Daniels called to confirm what we already knew. We have arrest warrants for Charles and Henry Hayes, as well as Jasmine Albright Hayes. We'll be bringing them in today. Will you need me to come in? I asked, both dreading and needing to face my sons. Not yet. We'll take their statements first, confront them with the evidence. The district attorney will want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss next steps. Next steps. As if there was a guidebook for what to do when your children murder your husband. That evening, Callahan and I sat in front of his small television, watching the local news. The anchor's solemn face filled the screen as she reported, breaking news tonight from Spring Creek. 3 arrests have been made in connection with the death of Ernest Hayes, a local handyman who was initially believed to have died from a workplace accident last week. Police have now confirmed Hayes was the victim of homicide. The suspects, whose names are being withheld pending formal charges, are reportedly family members of the deceased. Sources tell us this case involves financial motives and may have been planned for months. We'll bring you more details as they become available. Family members. They wouldn't name my sons on air yet, but soon everyone in Spring Creek would know. Our family name would become synonymous with greed and betrayal. You should get some sleep, Callahan suggested, turning off the television. Tomorrow will be difficult, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake thinking of Ernest, of our sons, of the long road ahead, a trial, testimony, having to face Charles and Henry across a courtroom, perhaps hear them deny everything despite the evidence. Or worse, hear them admit what they'd done. Morning brought a call from the district attorney, a woman named Catherine Martinez, whom I'd never met. Mrs. Hayes, I'm handling your husband's case. I've reviewed the evidence, and I believe we have a strong case for first-degree murder against all 3 suspects. But I wanted to speak with you personally before proceeding with formal charges. You want to know if I can testify against my own sons, I said quietly. It won't come to that if they accept a plea deal, she assured me. With the evidence we have, especially the recordings and your husband's journal, they'd be foolish to risk a trial. And if they do, then yes, we would need your testimony. I won't sugarcoat this, Mrs. Hayes. It would be incredibly difficult. But without you, your husband may not get justice. After we hung up, I sat on the cabin's small porch, watching birds flit between trees, trying to make sense of the impossible choice before me. The sound of approaching tires on gravel made me tense, but it was only Officer Daniels's patrol car. He approached with a grim expression. Mrs. Hayes, I thought you should hear this from me in person rather than over the phone. Charles and Henry are claiming you killed your husband. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. What? They're saying you were unhappy in the marriage, that you stood to gain from the insurance, that you had access to sleeping pills and mixed them with methanol in his evening whiskey. They're trying to frame you for the murder they committed. My own sons, not content with killing their father, they would now try to send their mother to prison. They won't succeed, Officer Daniels added quickly. The evidence doesn't support their claims. But I wanted you to be prepared. This is getting ugly. Uglier than I could have imagined. As Officer Daniels drove away, I realized there was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation, no chance to salvage even a shred of the family we had once been. My sons had not only taken Ernest from me, they had destroyed everything we had built together. That night, I finally wept, not just for Ernest, but for Charles and Henry, for the loss of the sons I thought I had raised, and for the lonely future stretching before me. The district attorney's office was located in the county courthouse, a stately brick building that had stood in the center of Spring Creek since 1912. I'd passed it countless times over the decades, but had never had reason to enter until now. The marble floors echoed with my footsteps as Officer Daniels escorted me to Catherine Martinez's office. Martinez was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s perhaps, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She rose from behind her desk to greet me, her handshake firm. "Mrs. Hayes, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." I settled into the chair across from her, hands folded tightly in my lap. On her desk lay several folders, one labeled with Ernest's name. "I won't waste your time," Martinez began. "The case against your sons and daughter-in-law is strong, but they're fighting back hard. They've hired Terrence Walsh." The name meant nothing to me, but Officer Daniels, who had remained standing by the door, let out a low whistle. "Walsh is a high-profile defense attorney from the city," Martinez explained. "Expensive, very good at what he does, which is creating reasonable doubt, often by shifting blame." "On to me," I said, understanding immediately. She nodded. "They're claiming you were jealous of your husband's relationship with your sons, that you resented their success while you and Ernest remained in modest circumstances. They say you were bitter, depressed, and looking for a way out, both of the marriage and your financial situation. The accusations were so absurd they might have been laughable if they weren't so painful. Ernest and I had been happy in our simple life. If anything, we'd pitied Charles and Henry, chasing money at the expense of everything else. There's more," Martinez continued, her expression grave. "They claim Ernest was planning to leave you, that he'd mentioned divorce to them. They're trying to establish that you had motive to kill him before he could. Leave with half of your marital assets." Tears stung my eyes. "Ernest would never," I began, then stopped, unable to finish. Martinez pushed a box of tissues toward me. "I know, and so will the jury once they see the evidence. Ernest's journal directly contradicts their claims. The recordings show your sons planning the murder, not you, and their financial troubles establish a clear motive." "But," I prompted, sensing her hesitation, "but they're going to make this as difficult as possible. They'll drag Ernest's name through the mud. They'll paint you as a manipulative, vengeful wife. It's going to get ugly, Mrs. Hayes. I want you to be prepared for that." I thought of my sons in the courtroom, watching coldly as their lawyers attacked my character, invented lies about their father. The thought made me physically ill. "What happens next?" I asked. "The arraignment is tomorrow. They'll enter their pleas, almost certainly not guilty. Then we begin the discovery process, sharing evidence, taking depositions. Eventually, if they don't accept a plea deal, we go to trial. How long? Months, most likely. The wheels of justice turn slowly, especially in high-profile cases like this. High profile. Of course it would be. A small town like Spring Creek hadn't seen a murder trial in decades, let alone one involving a family turning against itself. "There's one more thing you should know," Martinez said, her tone softening slightly. "Your son's financial situation is worse than we initially thought. Charles's business is not just failing, it's drowning in debt. The bank is foreclosing on his house. Henry has gambling debts to some very dangerous people. They were desperate. Desperate enough to kill their father," I said quietly, "to try to frame their mother." Martinez nodded solemnly. As Officer Daniels drove me back to Callahan's cabin, I stared out the window at the town that had been my home for most of my life. Spring Creek looked different now, tainted by betrayal, by the knowledge that my own children had become monsters in the midst of this quiet community. "They're saying terrible things about you in town," Officer Daniels said suddenly, breaking the silence. Your sons, I mean. They've been telling anyone who'll listen that you were abusive, that you controlled Ernest, isolated him. I closed my eyes, the pain almost physical. And people believe them? Some do. Charles has always been persuasive, and people don't want to believe sons could kill their father. It's easier to blame the widow. Of course it was. The grieving widow, suddenly alone, was an easy target for suspicion. It followed the familiar script of crime shows and thriller novels. The devoted sons trying to protect their father's legacy made for a more comfortable narrative than the truth. Not everyone believes them, Daniels added quickly. Those who really knew you and Ernest, they know better. But how many people had truly known us? We'd lived quietly, kept to ourselves in many ways. Ernest had his workshop friends. I had my sewing circle, but we'd never been social butterflies. We'd been too busy working, raising our sons, making ends meet. When we reached the cabin, Callahan was waiting on the porch, his expression grim. What is it? I asked as I climbed out of the patrol car. You have a visitor, he said. Jasmine's sister, Elaine. She says she has information about the case. My heart raced. Jasmine's sister? Here? How did she find this place? She didn't, Callahan explained. She went to the police station looking for you. Daniels called me and I agreed to bring her here. He nodded toward a small blue car parked beside his truck. Officer Daniels confirmed this with a nod. She seems genuinely concerned, Mrs. Hayes. Says she has evidence that could help you. I hesitated, then nodded. All right, I'll speak with her. Inside, Elaine Albright sat perched on the edge of Callahan's sofa, looking distinctly out of place in the rustic cabin. Unlike her sister's polished elegance, Elaine had a softer appearance. Curly hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup, nervous hands twisting in her lap. She stood when I entered. Mrs. Hayes, thank you for seeing me. Elaine, I acknowledged. I'd met her only a few times at family gatherings, where she'd always seemed overshadowed by her more confident sister. Officer, Daniel says you have information. She nodded, glancing nervously at Callahan and Daniels. I do. About Jasmine. About what they did to Ernest. You can speak freely, I assured her. Everyone here is trying to help me find justice for my husband. Elaine took a deep breath. Jasmine called me the night Ernest died. She was elated. Said their problem had been taken care of. I didn't know what she meant then, but she'd been complaining about Ernest for months. How he wouldn't sell the house. How he was standing in the way of Charles's big development deal. My throat tightened. You have proof of this call? She nodded, pulling out her phone. I have our text messages from that night. And, she hesitated, I have recordings of my own. Jasmine talking about the methanol, about how they planned everything. You recorded your own sister? Daniels asked, surprised. Elaine's expression hardened. Jasmine has been manipulating people her entire life. She's always gotten away with it because she's beautiful, charming when she wants to be. I started recording our conversations months ago, after she began talking about Ernest as an obstacle that needed to be removed. I was afraid of what she might do. But you didn't warn Ernest? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. Shame crossed Elaine's face. I thought she was just talking, venting. I never believed she would actually. She swallowed hard. I never thought Charles and Henry would go along with it. Not until it was too late. Why come forward now? Callahan asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Because they're trying to blame Mrs. Hayes, Elaine said, looking directly at me. Jasmine called me last night, asked me to lie for her, to say I'd heard Mrs. Hayes threatening Ernest. I won't do it. I won't help them frame an innocent woman for what they did. I studied her face, looking for deception, for an ulterior motive. I found only what appeared to be genuine remorse. The recordings, I said. What exactly do they contain? Jasmine explaining how methanol poisoning works. Jasmine discussing with Charles how to stage the accident in Ernest's workshop after he was already dead. Jasmine, she faltered. Jasmine laughing about how easy it was to convince Henry to go along with it, how he'd do anything Charles told him to. My younger son, always in his brother's shadow. Always. Seeking approval, it made a terrible kind of sense. These recordings could be crucial, Daniel said. We'll need to authenticate them, of course, but if they're genuine... They are, Elaine insisted. I'll testify to that. I'll testify to everything. As she handed over her phone to Daniels, I saw something I hadn't expected. a small act of courage from someone who had clearly lived in fear of her sister for a long time. It wouldn't bring Ernest back, but it might help ensure that his killers face justice. "Thank you," I said simply. Elaine met my eyes, her own filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hayes. I should have done something sooner." After she and Daniels left, Callahan poured me a cup of tea, adding a splash of whiskey from a flask he kept in his pocket. "For the nerves?" he explained. I accepted the cup gratefully. "Do you think her evidence will help? If it's authentic, it could be the nail in the coffin for their defense," he said. "Especially if Jasmine was stupid enough to explicitly discuss the murder on these recordings." For the first time since Ernest's death, I felt a glimmer of hope that justice might truly be possible. The courthouse was packed the next morning. News of the arrests had spread through Spring Creek like wildfire, and it seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the spectacle of the Hayes family tragedy. I sat in the front row of the gallery, Callahan beside me, feeling the weight of curious eyes and whispered comments. When the side door opened and the bailiff let in Charles, Henry, and Jasmine, I barely recognized my own sons. Prison jumpsuits had replaced their usual expensive attire. Charles's normally perfect hair was disheveled, his confident posture diminished. Henry looked worse, pale, haunted, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom until they landed on me. For a brief moment, something like shame crossed his face before he quickly looked away. Jasmine, by contrast, maintained her composure. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression one of dignified suffering. She looked like a woman wrongfully accused, playing her role to perfection. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Harriman entered. A stern woman in her 60s, she surveyed the courtroom with practiced authority before taking her seat. "Case number 24, CR 187, State versus Charles Hayes, Henry Hayes, and Jasmine Albright Hayes," the clerk announced. "Charges are murder in the first degree and conspiracy to commit murder." Judge Harriman looked over her glasses at the defendants. "How do you plead?" Their attorney, Terrence Walsh, a sleek, silver-haired man in an expensive suit, stood. "Your Honor, my clients plead not guilty to all charges." "So entered," the judge replied. "Bail?" Catherine Martinez rose from the prosecution table. "The state requests that all defendants be held without bail, Your Honor. The charges are extremely serious, the evidence substantial, and the defendants pose a flight risk given their financial resources and the potential penalties they face." Walsh immediately objected. "Your Honor, my clients are respected members of this community with deep ties to Spring Creek. They are not flight risks. We request reasonable bail." Judge Harriman considered this briefly. Given the severity of the charges and the nature of the evidence described in the affidavit, bail is denied. The defendants will remain in custody pending trial. Charles's face flushed with anger. Beside him, Henry seemed to physically shrink. Jasmine remained impassive, though I caught a flash of calculation in her eyes as she scanned the courtroom. The judge set dates for future hearings, and just like that, the arraignment was over. As the bailiff led them out, Charles turned to look directly at me, his expression cold with hatred. The son I had raised, the boy who had once brought me dandelion bouquets and homemade Mother's Day cards, now looked at me as if I were his worst enemy. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, thrusting microphones toward Martinez, toward Walsh, toward me. Callahan acted as a buffer, helping me navigate through the crowd to a waiting car. "Mrs. Hayes, how does it feel to see your sons charged with your husband's murder?" one reporter called out. "Is it true they tried to frame you for the crime?" shouted another. I kept my head down, saying nothing as Callahan helped me into the car. Through the window, I could see Walsh giving a statement on the courthouse steps, his expression confident as cameras flashed around him. "He's playing to the media," Martinez said from the front passenger seat. She had offered to drive me back to Callahan's cabin to discuss next steps, trying to sway potential jurors before we even get to trial. "What was he saying?" I asked. The usual defense attorney spin. His clients are innocent. They're being railroaded. The real killer is still out there. She turned to look at me. "Mrs. Hayes, I should warn you. We've received notice that Jasmine's sister's recordings have been added to the evidence list. Walsh will likely move to have them suppressed, but if they're admitted, they'll be played in open court." The thought of hearing my sons and Jasmine discussing Ernest's murder, perhaps even laughing about it as Elaine had suggested, made me physically ill. "I understand," I managed to say. Back at the cabin, Martinez spread files across Callahan's kitchen table. The grand jury indictment was based primarily on the medical examiner's report, Ernest's journal, and Mr. Callahan's recordings. With Elaine Albright's evidence added, our case is even stronger. What about their claim that I killed Ernest? I asked. Are people actually believing that? Martinez's expression softened slightly. Some might, initially. It's a common defense strategy. Create an alternative suspect. But the evidence simply doesn't support their theory. Your fingerprints weren't on the methanol container found in Charles's garage. You weren't financially desperate like they were. And most importantly, Ernest's own journal explicitly names them as threats, not you. They knew what they were doing, Callahan added. The sleeping pills they took from your medicine cabinet, they were hoping your fingerprints on the bottle would implicate you if anyone got suspicious. I nodded, trying to process the calculated cruelty of it all. My sons hadn't just killed their father. They'd deliberately laid groundwork to blame me if their plan went awry. What happens now? I asked. We prepare for trial, Martinez replied. There will be preliminary hearings, motions from both sides, discovery exchanges. It could be several months before we actually get to trial. And I just wait? The thought of months in limbo, hiding at Callahan's cabin, unable to return to my home or my life, was almost unbearable. Unfortunately, yes. It's not safe for you to return home yet. Not while public opinion is still so divided. Walsh is already working to paint you as the real villain in this story. After Martinez left, Callahan found me sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the woods surrounding his property. He handed me a mug of coffee and sat beside me. You're thinking about going home anyway, aren't you? He asked perceptively. I nodded. I can't hide forever, Stephen. That house, it's all I have left of the life Ernest and I built together. I can't let them take that from me, too. It's not safe, he countered. Charles and Henry might be in jail, but they have friends, supporters, people who believe their lies about you. I can't live in fear, I said firmly. Ernest wouldn't want that for me. Callahan studied me for a long moment, then sighed. At least let me stay with you then, until this is over. I promised Ernest I'd keep you safe, and I intend to keep that promise. His unexpected kindness brought tears to my eyes. In the midst of all this betrayal and pain, this near stranger had become my most steadfast ally. Thank you, I said simply. The next morning, we drove back to Spring Creek, to the house on Maple Street that had been my home for 4 decades. Yellow police tape still crossed the front door, a reminder that this had been designated a crime scene after evidence of methanol was found in Ernest's workshop. Officer Daniels met us there, removing the tape and handing me a copy of the police report. The crime scene unit is finished, Mrs. Hayes. The house is officially released back to you. I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly afraid of what awaited inside. Not physical dangers, but the emotional assault of memories. Ernest's coffee mug still in the sink, his slippers by his armchair, his scent lingering on his pillow. Callahan seemed to understand. I'll go in first, he offered. Make sure everything's as it should be. But this was something I needed to face on my own. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the house that had once been filled with love and family, now hollowed out by betrayal and death. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it that day at the cemetery, when the first text message had arrived and my world had begun to unravel. Ernest's presence was everywhere, the worn spot on his armchair, the stack of Western paperbacks on the side table, the peg by the door where his work jacket still hung. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar objects, reacquainting myself with the home that had witnessed our entire marriage. In the kitchen, I found a notepad where Ernest had jotted his last shopping list. Ordinary items like coffee, bread, the peppermints he liked to keep in his pockets. Such mundane evidence of a life interrupted. Upstairs, our bedroom was still in disarray from my hasty packing. I straightened the quilt on Ernest's side of the bed, smoothing it with trembling hands. On his nightstand sat the last book he'd been reading, a dog-eared copy of Lonesome Dove, with a bookmark still in place on page 247. He would never know how the story ended. Grief washed over me anew, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing myself to fully feel the loss of the man who had been my partner for 42 years. Not just the shock of his murder, not just the betrayal by our sons, but the simple, devastating absence of Ernest himself, his voice, his laugh, his steady presence that had anchored my world. For the first time since that text message at the cemetery, I allowed myself to truly mourn. 6 months passed before the case of Ernest's murder finally went to trial. 6 months of legal maneuvering, of pretrial motions, of life in a strange limbo where I was neither fully widow nor fully mother anymore. I had returned to my routine as best I could. I resumed my sewing work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. I tended Ernest's garden, keeping his flowers alive through summer and preparing the beds for winter. Callahan stayed in our guest room, a quiet, steadfast presence that made me feel safe, despite the occasional threatening letter in the mail or harsh words from former friends who had chosen to believe Charles's lies. The town had divided, as small towns do in times of scandal. Some neighbors brought casseroles and offered quiet support. Others crossed the street to avoid me, whispered behind their hands when I passed. I held my head high, knowing the truth would eventually come out. On the first day of the trial, I wore a simple navy dress, one Ernest had always liked, and the small pearl earrings he'd given me on our 40th anniversary. Callahan drove me to the courthouse, where Martinez waited on the steps. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. I nodded, though in truth, I didn't know if anyone could truly be ready to sit in a courtroom and hear the details of how their children had murdered their father. Inside, the gallery was packed. The Hayes murder trial had become something of a sensation, drawing curiosity seekers from neighboring towns and even a few true crime enthusiasts who had traveled from the city. I kept my eyes forward, ignoring the whispers and stares. Charles, Henry, and Jasmine sat at the defense table, all three dressed in conservative attire that couldn't quite disguise the months they'd spent in county jail. Charles looked thinner, his once perfect hair now showing threads of gray. Henry appeared haggard, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Only Jasmine maintained her composure, her back straight, her expression serene as if she were attending a garden party rather than her own murder trial. Judge Harriman called the court to order, and the trial began with opening statements. Martinez went first, her voice clear and confident as she laid out the prosecution's case. "This is a case about greed," she told the jury. "About three people who decided that money was more important than family, more important than decency, more important than human life. The evidence will show that the defendants, Charles Hayes, Henry Hayes, and Jasmine Albright Hayes, carefully planned and executed the murder of Ernest Hayes, a beloved husband and father, for financial gain." Walsh countered with a defense centered around reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative theories and pointing fingers at me, the supposedly bitter wife who stood to gain from Ernest's death. I sat stone-faced through his accusations, knowing the evidence would speak for itself. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over the next 2 weeks. The medical examiner testified about the methanol poisoning that had killed Ernest. Police officers described the search of Charles's garage where they'd found the container of methanol with his fingerprints on it. Financial experts detailed the crushing debt that had motivated the crime. Then came the recordings. First Callahan's, capturing my sons discussing their father's murder as casually as they might discuss a business transaction, then Elaine's, which revealed Jasmine's cold calculation in planning every detail. The courtroom fell silent as Jasmine's voice filled the room. "It has to look natural. Old men have heart attacks all the time. The methanol will cause similar symptoms, but it needs to be the right dose. Enough to kill him, but not so much that it's obvious. Charles, are you listening? This has to be perfect." Charles's voice. "I'm listening. What about Mom? She'll be suspicious." Jasmine's laugh, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Your mother? That mousy little woman who's spent her whole life in your father's shadow? She'll be too broken to ask questions, and if she does, we'll handle her too." I closed my eyes, fighting back tears as my daughter-in-law discussed my potential murder so casually. Beside me, Callahan placed a supportive hand on my arm. The defense tried to attack the recordings, questioning their authenticity, suggesting they had been edited or manipulated. But forensic experts confirmed their validity, and Elaine's testimony about making them was unwavering despite Walsh's aggressive cross-examination. "My sister has always been capable of terrible things," Elaine testified, avoiding Jasmine's icy glare from the defense table. "I started recording our conversations when she began talking about Ernest as a problem that needed solving. I never thought it would go this far, but I knew I needed to document what was happening." The most difficult day came when I took the stand. Martinez had prepared me thoroughly, but nothing could truly ready me for sitting across from my sons, testifying to evidence that would send them to prison for life. "Mrs. Hayes," Martinez began gently, Can you tell the court about your husband's concerns in the months before his death? I described Ernest's growing suspicions, his discovery of the forged insurance documents, his hiring of Callahan. I read excerpts from his journal, my voice breaking as I shared his final entry, his certainty that our sons meant him harm, his desperate attempt to protect me even after his death. During cross-examination, Walsh tried to paint me as a jealous, controlling wife who resented her son's success and her husband's supposed desire for a more exciting life. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Hayes," he pressed, "that you and Ernest argued frequently about selling the house? That you were the one who refused to move, who kept him tied to a life he had outgrown?" I met his gaze steadily. "No. Ernest and I were happy in our home. We had discussed it many times and agreed we wanted to stay there. It was Charles and Jasmine who kept pressuring us to sell." "And yet," Walsh continued, "your sons say Ernest confided in them about wanting to leave, about feeling trapped." "My sons are lying," I interrupted, my voice stronger than I had expected, "just as they lied about how their father died, just as they're lying now to save themselves." I looked directly at Charles and Henry then, seeing not the men they had become, but the boys they had once been. Ernest loved our life together. He loved our home. He loved me. And despite everything, he loved you too. That's what makes this so tragic. He never stopped loving his sons, even when he realized what they were planning to do. Walsh had no response to that simple truth. The defense case was weak by comparison. Character witnesses spoke to Charles and Henry's business acumen, to Jasmine's community involvement. Financial experts tried to downplay their money troubles, but none could explain away the recordings, the methanol found in Charles's garage, the mountain of evidence pointing to their guilt. Charles, Henry, and Jasmine all declined to testify in their own defense, unwilling to face cross-examination that would expose the contradictions in their story. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. I sat in the courtroom as Martinez delivered her closing argument, systematically, dismantling every alternative theory the defense had proposed. "Ernest Hayes was a good man," she concluded, "who worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. He deserved to grow old with his wife of 42 years. Instead, his own children decided that his life was worth less than the property he owned, less than the insurance money they could collect. They poisoned him, staged an accident, and then tried to blame his grieving widow. The evidence is overwhelming. Justice demands a guilty verdict." Walsh's closing seemed desperate by comparison, grasping at minor inconsistencies and appealing to emotion rather than evidence. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, I caught Henry's eye. For a brief moment, something like regret crossed his face before Charles leaned over to whisper something that made him look away. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before reaching their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harriman asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of murder in the first degree against defendant Charles Hayes, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the count of murder in the first degree against defendant Henry Hayes, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the count of murder in the first degree against defendant Jasmine Albright Hayes, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The conspiracy charges brought the same result. Guilty on all counts, for all 3 defendants. I closed my eyes, relief and grief washing over me in equal measure. Ernest had his justice at last. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. I sat in the same seat I had occupied throughout the trial, watching as Judge Harriman prepared to determine the fate of my sons and daughter-in-law. "Before I pronounce sentence," she said, "do any of the defendants wish to make a statement?" Charles declined, his expression cold and unrepentant. Jasmine also remained silent, her perfect posture, and empty eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. But Henry stood, his hands shaking visibly as he turned not toward the judge, but toward me. "Mom," he began, his voice cracking, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know I'm sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for what we did. For what I let happen." He paused, swallowing hard. "Charles said it would be easy. Clean. That Dad wouldn't suffer. But he did suffer. I saw it. And I did nothing. I've thought about that every day since." Tears streamed down his face now. "I was weak. I was a coward. I let my brother and Jasmine convince me that money mattered more than family. I'll regret that for the rest of my life." He sat down abruptly, ignoring Charles's furious glare. It wasn't a full confession. He was still minimizing his role, suggesting he had been led astray rather than actively participating. But it was something. A crack in the wall of lies they had built. Judge Harriman's sentence was severe but just. Life imprisonment for all 3 defendants, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Charles and Jasmine showed no visible reaction. Henry simply nodded, as if accepting a fate he had known was coming. As they were led away, Charles looked back at me one last time. Not with remorse like Henry, but with cold hatred, as if I were responsible for his downfall rather than his own actions. Jasmine didn't look back at all. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, hungry for a statement from the widow whose sons had been sentenced to life in prison. Martinez suggested I say nothing, but I felt compelled to speak, not for the media's benefit, but for Ernest's. Justice has been served today, I said simply. Not vengeance, but justice. My husband was a good man who deserved far better than the death he received. I hope that someday, my sons will truly understand what they've thrown away. Not just their freedom, but the love of a father who would have done anything for them. With that, I walked away, Callahan at my side, leaving the reporters calling questions that I would never answer. The weeks that followed were quiet ones. The media attention gradually faded. The neighbors who had avoided me began to nod in greeting again. Spring Creek slowly returned to its normal rhythms, the Hayes tragedy becoming just another story to tell, another scandal to remember. Callahan returned to his cabin after ensuring I was truly safe, though he still checked in regularly. We had developed a friendship born of shared trauma and mutual respect. Nothing romantic, but a steady companionship that helped ease the loneliness. 3 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived from the state penitentiary where Henry was serving his time. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finding the courage to open it. "Dear Mom," it began. "I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away, but I need to write it anyway." What followed was a full confession, not the partial one he'd offered at sentencing, but a complete accounting of his role in Ernest's murder. He described his gambling debts, his desperation, how easily he'd been swayed by Charles's promises that no one would get hurt. "I knew it was wrong," he wrote. "Every step of the way I knew, but I was too much of a coward to stop it. Too afraid of Charles, too afraid of the loan sharks, too weak to stand up for what was right." He ended with words that brought both pain and a strange sense of closure. "Dad raised us better than this. He deserved better than this. You deserved better than this. I don't ask for forgiveness. I know that's impossible. But I wanted you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what we did. Not because I got caught, but because it was wrong. Because I lost not just my freedom, but my soul." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in Ernest's journal, which I kept in the bedside drawer. Henry's remorse couldn't bring Ernest back, couldn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it was something, a tiny flicker of the sun I had once known, not entirely extinguished beneath the man he had become. Charles never wrote. I heard through Martinez that he had already filed appeals, still proclaiming his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. Jasmine, I learned, had filed for divorce within weeks of the sentencing, already seeking to distance herself from the Hayes name and perhaps position herself for a future parole hearing. 1 year to the day after Ernest's death, I visited his grave. The cemetery was peaceful, the spring flowers in bloom, just as they had been on that terrible day when the first anonymous text had arrived. I placed a simple bouquet of daisies, his favorite, on the headstone, running my eyes, fingers over his name carved in granite. "I kept my promise, Ernest," I whispered. "I found the truth. I made sure there was justice." As I stood to leave, I noticed an elderly man watching from a respectful distance. It took me a moment to recognize Jim from the VFW, the friend who had recommended Callahan to Ernest. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, approaching slowly. "I've been meaning to stop by your house, but I wasn't sure if visitors were welcome." "They are," I assured him, "especially friends of Ernest's." "He was a good man," Jim said simply. "The best kind. Honest, hardworking, devoted to you." "Yes," I agreed. "He was. Some of us from the VFW, we've been talking. Ernest always helped everyone with repairs, never asked for much in return. We'd like to keep his workshop going, maybe as a community space where kids could learn woodworking. If you'd be willing, that is." The idea brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Ernest's workshop, the place he had loved most, continuing to serve others, to create beautiful things, to teach the skills he had valued. He would have liked that, I said. Very much. In the months that followed, Ernest's workshop became exactly that, a place where veterans taught young people the crafts Ernest had practiced all his life. I donated his tools, his wood supply, everything except the small wooden box where he had kept special projects. That I kept on my nightstand, a tangible reminder of his clever hands and creative mind. Life continued. Not the life I had expected to have in my 60s, not the quiet retirement Ernest and I had planned. Together, but a life with purpose, nonetheless. I expanded my sewing into quilting, creating memorial quilts for families who had lost loved ones. I volunteered at the hospital where Nancy Jenkins still worked. I even began teaching some of the younger girls in town how to sew, a skill becoming rare in an age of fast fashion and disposable clothing. The house on Maple Street remained my home, though the hotel developers still occasionally sent offers. I declined them all. This was where Ernest and I had built our life together, raised our family, loved each other through good times and bad. Its walls held our history, not just the tragic end, but the 4 decades of joy that had preceded it. Sometimes at night, sitting on the porch swing Ernest had built, I could almost feel him beside me, his presence a comfort rather than a haunting. In those quiet moments, I would remember what he had once told me on our 30th anniversary. Love isn't grand gestures, Margot. It's showing up every day. It's fixing what's broken. It's staying when leaving would be easier. Ernest had lived by those words. He had shown up every day of our marriage, fixed what needed fixing, stayed steadfast through hardships. In the end, he had died trying to protect me, his final act one of love and sacrifice. My sons had chosen a different path, one of greed, betrayal, and ultimately destruction. Their actions had cost them not just their freedom, but their humanity, their connection to everything good and true that their father had tried to teach them. As for me, I had found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The quiet handyman's wife, the background figure in her family's drama, had stood firm through unimaginable betrayal and come through not broken, but transformed. Not by vengeance or bitterness, but by the simple, powerful act of seeking truth and justice. I still wore my wedding ring, still spoke to Ernest sometimes when I was alone in our house, still missed him with an ache that never quite subsided. But I had found a way forward, a path lit by memories of love rather than shadows of betrayal. The truth may wound, Ernest used to say, but lies poison. In the end, that was what had destroyed our sons, not the truth I had pursued, but the lies they had embraced. The poison of greed had corrupted them long before they had poisoned their father. Justice had been served, but, there was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, only the quiet knowledge that Ernest could rest in peace, his murderers held accountable, his legacy preserved not in the sons who had betrayed him, but in the wife who had loved him, in the workshop that continued his work, in the truth that had finally come to light. In the end, that would have to be enough.